They kicked the homeless girl out into the freezing rain, never realizing the man watching from the black sedan was the Korean Mafia boss who had spent 15 years searching for his lost sister. The rain was a deluge in Seoul that night. The neon signs of Gangnam blurred into streaks of neon pink and blue, but on the sidewalk, the world was gray and unforgiving. Most people were rushing home to warm beds, shielding their eyes from the storm. But not Nari Saman. She stood trembling in the shelter's doorway, her hands clutching a small, wet bag, all she had left in the world. She was exhausted, shivering, her spirit worn thin as her tattered brown jacket. The shelter manager didn't care about the storm. He didn't care that she had nowhere to go. He shoved her back into the downpour and slammed the heavy iron door. "We're full," he spat through the glass. "Go be a ghost somewhere else." Nari wanted to beg. She wanted to scream that she wouldn't survive the night, but her voice was gone. So, she stepped into the street. The wind tore at her hair, and the icy water soaked through her shoes in seconds. Her legs, weak from hunger, finally wobbled and gave out. She collapsed onto the freezing pavement, her breath coming in shallow, broken gasps as the rain washed over her like a shroud. The manager watched from the warm security of the window and drew the blinds, turning away from the girl he thought was a nobody. What he didn't know, what he could never have suspected, was that a heavy black sedan had just screeched to a halt at the curb. The man stepping out, his jaw tight and eyes burning with a decade of buried rage, was Yoon Tae-sung, the most feared mafia boss in the city. As he knelt in the mud and lifted the girl's chin with a gloved hand, he didn't see a beggar. He saw the sister he had sworn to find or burn the city down trying. Before we continue this journey of blood, loyalty, and the ultimate revenge, if you love stories about hidden identities and protectors who will do anything for family, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens to the man who put her in the rain. Nari Saman learned early on that to be homeless in a city of glass and gold was to be a ghost. In the gleaming districts of Seoul, where the scent of expensive roasting coffee and designer perfumes hung heavy in the air, she was a smudge on the landscape, a glitch in the perfect scenery. She spent her mornings curled in the shadows of the subway vents, her body vibrating with the mechanical hum of a world that didn't know she existed. As the sun climbed, Nari began her daily ritual of invisibility. She moved through the crowds of Gangnam, a slip of a girl in a worn brown jacket, careful to never make eye contact. To look up was to invite the sting of 1,000 judgmental stares. She watched the feet of the people passing by, shiny leather loafers, pristine white sneakers, and high heels that clicked like ticking clocks. No one stopped. No one looked down. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion that lived in her ribs. Around noon, she stood near the entrance of a high-end bakery, the warmth of the vents blowing the scent of sugar and butter toward her. She wasn't begging, she was simply breathing, trying to remember what it felt like to be full. A group of vibrant, young students, girls with perfectly manicured nails and boys in oversized, expensive hoodies, spilled out of the shop, laughing. One of the boys, holding a box of expensive macarons, caught sight of her. For a moment, Nari felt a spark of hope, a memory of a time when people looked at her with kindness. But the boy's expression didn't soften. He nudged his friend, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look at that," he whispered loud enough for the wind to carry. "The scenery is getting ruined again." His girlfriend giggled, adjusting her silk scarf. "It's so sad that they let them stay here. It's practically a public health hazard." As they passed, the boy deliberately dropped a half-eaten pastry into the slushy mud near Nari's feet. "Oops," he mocked, his eyes cold and hollow. "Lunch is served, sweetheart." Nari looked at the ruined cake, then at the retreating backs of the group. She didn't feel anger. Anger was a luxury for people who had a place to sleep. She felt only a hollow, crushing shame. She retreated further into the alleyway, pressing her back against the cold brick wall. She clutched the small, tattered locket hidden beneath her shirt, the only thing she had left from a life she could no longer remember. She was a nobody. A ghost. A girl whose own shadow seemed to want to detach itself and find a better life. She didn't know that miles away, in a room filled with monitors and maps, a man was screaming her name into the void. She didn't know that the invisibility she used to survive was the very thing keeping her brother in a state of living death. She simply closed her eyes and waited for the night to come, unaware that the stars were finally aligning to bring the storm that would change everything. The sky over Seoul didn't just darken that evening, it bruised, turning a deep, sickly purple before the heavens finally tore open. The rain began as a cold mist but quickly transformed into a violent, rhythmic assault. It was the kind of storm that drove even the bravest souls indoors, turning the city's concrete veins into slick, treacherous rivers. For Noir, the rain was more than an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. She arrived at the community shelter gasping for air, her lungs burning from the humid chill. The light spilling from the shelter's frosted windows looked like a sanctuary, a golden promise of safety. But as she reached for the handle, the door swung open, and the manager stepped out, his face twisted in a mask of bureaucratic indifference. He didn't see a girl, he saw a liability. "We're over capacity, Noir," he said, his voice flat against the roar of the downpour. He didn't look at her shivering frame or the way her soaked jacket clung to her skin like a second, freezing layer of ice. "I told you last week, you need to find another place. You're bad for the intake numbers." "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just for tonight. I don't need a bed. I'll sit in the hallway. I'll stay in the corner. It's freezing out here." The manager sighed, a sound of pure irritation, and reached for her shoulder, not to comfort her, but to steer her toward the steps. With a sharp shove, he forced her back into the deluge. "Rules are rules. Go find a subway station. You're not my problem anymore." The heavy iron door slammed shut, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in Noir's chest like a gunshot. She stood there for a long moment, the rain instantly blinding her. Every drop felt like a needle. She tried to walk, her feet heavy and numb, but the sidewalk was a blur of gray and shadow. The world began to tilt. The neon lights of the distant skyscrapers danced and flickered, mocking her from their warm heights. She made it halfway down the block before the strength finally drained from her marrow. Her knees hit the wet pavement first, the impact dull and distant. She crawled toward a darkened storefront, hoping for a sliver of an overhang, but her fingers went slack. She collapsed, her cheek resting against the freezing concrete, watching the rain dance in the gutters. As her vision began to fray at the edges, a pair of blinding white headlights cut through the gloom. A heavy, black sedan pulled to the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, Noir saw a door open. A pair of polished black boots stepped into the mud, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence of the storm was broken by a voice that sounded like a memory she had long since buried. In a towering glass monolith overlooking the heart of the city, Yoon Taesung stood before a wall of windows, his reflection ghost-like against the storm outside. While the rest of Seoul sought warmth, Taesung lived in a permanent winter. For 15 years, the air in his lungs had felt like shards of ice, a reminder of the night his family was torn apart and his younger sister, Noir, vanished into the shadows of a rival's greed. His office was a sanctuary of cold precision, but the desk behind him was cluttered with the debris of an obsession. Faded police reports, grainy CCTV stills from 100 different bus stations, and a singular, crumpled sketch of a young girl with eyes that held the spark of their mother's spirit. His men feared his silence more than his anger, for they knew that behind his still expression, Taesung was burning. He had dismantled syndicates and rebuilt empires, amassing power that made prime ministers tremble, yet he could not find a single girl in a city of 10 million. The guilt was a heavy, physical weight, a burden he wore beneath his tailored Italian suits. Every time he sat for a meal, he wondered if she was hungry. Every time the temperature dropped, he felt the phantom chill of her absence. He had become a monster to protect his territory, a predator in the concrete jungle, all in the hopes that his reach would eventually grow long enough to pull her back from the dark. His right-hand man entered the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He didn't speak, he simply held out a tablet. On the screen was a blurry image from a street camera near a downtown shelter, a girl in a brown jacket, her face partially obscured by the rain. It was a lead as thin as a spider's silk, one of thousands they had followed into dead ends. But as Taesung magnified the image, his heart, usually a stone in his chest, gave a sudden, violent thud. Around the girl's neck was the faint glint of a silver chain, the locket. He didn't issue an order. He didn't have to. Within seconds, Taesung was moving, his long coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark omen. He descended to the basement garage where his armored sedan waited, its engine already purring with a low, predatory intent. As the car tore through the rain-slicked streets, Taesung stared out at the blurring neon lights. He wasn't thinking about business or rivals. He was thinking of a promise made to a dying mother. He was a man who had everything, yet he was hollowed out by the search. The burden of the searcher was the hope that killed you a little more each day, but tonight, the fire in his veins felt different. Tonight, the storm wasn't just a backdrop, it was the path leading him home. The black sedan didn't just stop, it claimed the street, its tires throwing up a spray of icy slush as it braked inches from where Noir lay. The world was a blur of gray rain and fading consciousness, but the sound of the car door opening was sharp, a metallic crack that pierced through the roar of the storm. Yoon Taesung stepped into the deluge, ignoring the umbrella his men tried to rush over his head. His polished boots crunched on the grit of the pavement as he moved toward the crumpled figure on the ground. He had looked at 1,000 faces in 1,000 alleys, and each time, his heart had returned to his chest like a leaden weight. But as he drew closer, the air seemed to vanish from the street. He knelt in the filth, his expensive wool coat soaking up the freezing rainwater. His gloved hand trembled, a movement no rival had ever lived to see, as he reached out to tilt Nari's chin upward. Her skin was the color of ash, her lips tinged with a terrifying blue, and her curly hair was matted against her forehead by the relentless downpour. Then, he saw it. Tangled in the collar of her damp, worn jacket was a thin silver chain. At the end of it hung a small, battered locket, its surface scratched by years of hardship but its shape unmistakable. It was the twin to the one he carried in his breast pocket every single day. Taesung's breath hitched, a jagged sound that was half sob and half growl. He brushed a stray, wet lock of hair from her face, his thumb lingering on her cheek with a tenderness that was haunting. In the hollows of her exhausted face, he saw the ghost of the 5-year-old girl who used to hide in his shadow to escape the sun. The girl he had failed to protect. The girl who had been a ghost for 15 years was suddenly warm, barely, under his touch. Nari, he whispered, the name a sacred vow breaking across his lips. Her eyes fluttered open for a fleeting second, glazed and unfocused, seeing only a dark silhouette against the flickering neon of the city. She didn't know him. She saw only another powerful man in a dark suit, another person who might hurt her. She flinched, a small, instinctive shiver of fear that sliced through Taesung deeper than any blade. "Don't, please," she wheezed, her voice a broken thread. Taesung's jaw tightened until the bone threatened to snap. The grief that had sustained him for over a decade curdled instantly into a lethal, protective rage. He leaned down, his forehead briefly touching hers, a silent promise made in the mud and the rain. He wouldn't just take her home, he would dismantle every person and every system that had allowed her to end up on this pavement. He slid his arms beneath her fragile frame and lifted her as if she were made of glass. As he turned back toward the car, his men stood in a silent, terrifying line, their heads bowed. The search was over. The war, he realized as he looked back at the closed doors of the shelter, was only just beginning. The transition from the freezing pavement to the silk sheets of the penthouse was a fever dream that Nari Saman couldn't quite grasp. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was no longer gray and drowning, it was gold, hushed, and terrifyingly still. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint, sterile scent of a private doctor's kit, a stark contrast to the stagnant rain and exhaust fumes she had inhaled for years. She lay paralyzed in a bed larger than any shelter room she had ever seen, the weight of the heavy duvet feeling like a leaden plate against her chest. To a girl who had spent 1,000 nights guarding her own breath, this much comfort felt like a trap. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, rhythmic throb, the lingering echo of the cold that had almost claimed her. A movement near the window made her breath hitch. A man sat in a high-backed velvet chair, his silhouette sharp against the city lights that glittered outside like fallen diamonds. He had discarded his tailored coat, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, but the intensity radiating from him remained unchanged. It was the man from the rain. When he realized she was awake, Taesung didn't move toward her immediately. He seemed to understand that to her, any sudden motion was a threat. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low, raspy vibration that stirred a forgotten chord in the back of her mind. "The doctor gave you something for the fever. You need to sleep." Nari pushed herself up, her fingers digging into the high thread count sheets. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the door. "I can't pay for this," she whispered, the instinct of the street rising up like a shield. "Whatever this is, I don't have anything to give you. Please, I need to go." She tried to swing her legs out of the bed, but her head spun, and she collapsed back against the pillows. Taesung was at her side in an instant, though he kept his hands visible and open. The sight of her struggling to flee from the very safety he had spent a lifetime building for her was a fresh blade in his heart. "You don't pay for your own home, Nari," he said, his voice breaking with a suppressed emotion that made her still. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her hand. "And you aren't going anywhere. For 15 years, the world took everything from you. Tonight, that ends. You don't know me yet, but I know the locket around your neck. I know the girl who used to cry when the thunder got too loud." Nari looked at him, her chest heaving. The word home felt like a foreign language, a sound she couldn't quite translate. She looked at this stranger, this dangerous, beautiful man with eyes full of a haunting sorrow, and for the first time since the iron door of the shelter slammed shut, she didn't hear the rain. She only heard the steady, thumping heartbeat of a man who looked like he would kill the sun just to keep her warm. Nari looked at him, her breath hitching in her chest. The name he had spoken, her name, felt like an echo from a canyon she had spent a lifetime trying to climb out of. She wanted to believe him, but the streets had taught her that hope was a poison that only made the eventual disappointment hurt more. "Anyone can find a name," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Anyone can see a locket. Why should I believe you're anything but another man who wants to own a piece of me?" Taesung didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his discarded waistcoat and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. With hands that were steady for the world but shook only for her, he withdrew a silver object. It was a locket, identical in every scratch and curve to the one around Nari's neck. He held it out in the palm of his hand, letting the warm light of the penthouse catch the tarnished metal. "There were two," he said softly, the iron in his voice melting into something raw. "Mother gave them to us the night the city went dark. She told me that as long as we held them, the blood in our veins would always find its way back to the same heart." He pressed a small hidden catch on the side of his locket. It clicked open, revealing a tiny, faded photograph of a woman with the same defiant curve of the lip that Nari possessed. But it was the inscription on the inside of the silver lid that stopped Nari's heart. "Taesung and Nari, the stars that never fade." Nari's fingers flew to her own locket. With trembling precision, she mirrored his movement. Her locket popped open, revealing the second half of that same photograph. The jagged edges of the two pictures, if brought together, would form a perfect whole. The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of 15 years of isolation collapsing in a single heartbeat. "I didn't just look for a girl, Nari," Taesung continued, stepping closer until he was kneeling by the edge of the bed, bringing himself level with her. "I looked for the missing half of my soul. I searched the docks, the shelters, and the morgues. I built an empire of shadows just so I could have enough eyes to find you. He reached out, and this time, Nari didn't pull away. He brushed a thumb over the birthmark just below her ear, a small, crescent-shaped mole that she had always tried to hide with her hair. You used to say it was a piece of the moon that fell on you, he whispered. A sob, jagged and hot, finally broke through Nari's defenses. It was the sound of a ghost becoming human again. She leaned forward, her forehead dropping against his shoulder, her hands fisted into his white shirt. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't a ghost in the rain. She wasn't a liability or a public health hazard. She was a sister. She was home. And as Taesung wrapped his powerful arms around her, his eyes turned toward the window, the warmth of the reunion hardening into a cold, predatory promise for those who had let her suffer. The morning at the community shelter began with the same sterile, bureaucratic efficiency that had defined it for years. The manager, a man named Mr. Han, adjusted his tie in the reflection of the glass door, whistling a tuneless melody. He felt lighter today. He had finally cleared the dead weight from his intake logs, specifically that girl, Nari. To him, she was a recurring error in his ledgers, a ghost who had lingered too long in his lobby. He didn't think about the freezing rain or the fact that he hadn't seen her seek cover anywhere else. In his mind, he was simply a man doing a difficult job, keeping the low-class elements from cluttering his pristine facility. He sat at his desk, sipping hot coffee, and began drafting a memo about increasing security to prevent loitering. The sun was out, but the air remained biting, a reminder of the storm that had almost claimed a life just feet from his doorstep. He was interrupted by a low, rhythmic thrumming that began to vibrate the pens on his desk. It sounded like a heavy heartbeat, deep and mechanical. Han looked out the window and froze. A motorcade of 5 identical black armored SUVs was pulling into the humble gravel lot of the shelter. They moved with a synchronization that signaled wealth and extreme danger. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the entrance, its tinted windows impenetrable. Han's heart began to hammer against his ribs, not out of guilt, but out of greed. Perhaps a wealthy donor had arrived? He smoothed his hair and rushed to the door, plastering a submissive, professional smile on his face. He stepped onto the porch, the same porch where he had shoved Nari into the mud only hours before. The back door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out whose presence seemed to suck the warmth right out of the morning air. Yoon Taesung didn't look like a donor, he looked like an executioner. He was flanked by 2 men in razor-sharp suits who stood with the silent, coiled tension of wolves. May I help you, sir?" Han stammered, his smile faltering as he caught the glint of Taesung's eyes. They weren't cold, they were incandescent with a focused, lethal promise. Taesung didn't answer. He walked toward the porch, his boots clicking with a terrifying cadence. He stopped just inches from Han, towering over him, the scent of expensive leather and cold metal surrounding the manager. Taesung looked down at the spot on the pavement where Nari's bag had been kicked. "You had a girl here last night," Taesung said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "In the rain." Han's throat went dry. We were at capacity, sir. Standard procedure. She was just a homeless girl, a nobody." The sound of Taesung's gloved hand catching Han by the throat cut the sentence short. The manager's feet left the ground as he was slammed against the very door he had locked against Nari. "That nobody," Taesung whispered into his ear, "is my sister. And you are about to learn exactly how long a night in the rain can feel." The iron grip on Mr. Han's throat didn't just restrict his air, it signaled the end of the world as he knew it. He clawed at Taesung's black leather gloves, his feet dangling uselessly above the porch, but he was struggling against an avalanche. Taesung's face remained a mask of terrifying calm, his eyes fixed on the manager with a cold, analytical curiosity, as if he were deciding which part of the man to break first. "You said she was a nobody," Taesung whispered, his voice barely audible over the idling engines of the SUVs. You said she was bad for your numbers. With a sudden, violent heave, Taesung threw the manager down the stairs. Han tumbled into the dirt, landing in the exact patch of frozen mud where Nari had collapsed the night before. He tried to scramble up, but a heavy black boot landed squarely on his chest, pinning him to the earth. Wait! Han wheezed, his face pale and splattered with grit. I didn't know. If I had known she was yours, I would have given her my own bed. Please, it was just a mistake. Taesung leaned down, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. It wasn't a mistake. It was your nature. You didn't fail to help a princess, you failed to help a human being. Taesung gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a heavy bucket of ice slurry mixed with the bitter runoff from the shelter's roof. Without a word, the man tipped the bucket. The freezing, gray water drenched Han, soaking through his expensive shirt and tie, shocking the breath from his lungs just as the rain had done to Nari. Han shivered violently, his teeth beginning to chatter a rhythmic, frantic beat. You're going to stay right here, Taesung commanded, his voice as sharp as a razor. My men will ensure you don't move. You will feel the wind. You will feel the ice. You will watch the people you turned away walk past you while you rot in the mud. You can't do this. Han cried, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. I'll call the police. Taesung tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a look that held no warmth, only a jagged, dark irony. I own the precinct, Mr. Han. I own the street you're lying on. And right now, I own the very air in your lungs. Taesung turned his back, walking toward the sedan without looking back. Behind him, his men formed a silent, impenetrable wall of black suits around the shivering manager. As the car door closed with a muted thud, Taesung looked at the silver locket in his hand. The price of cruelty was high, and for Mr. Han, the bill was just starting to come due. The girl who was a ghost had found her voice, and it spoke through the man who was now the city's living nightmare. While the justice being served at the shelter felt like a victory, it had also sent a signal through the city's underworld. In the dark, interconnected web of Seoul's power players, Yoon Taesung's sudden, reckless display of emotion was a flare in the night. He had moved with a personal fury that he usually reserved for territory wars, and the Shadow Syndicate, a rival organization that had been waiting years for Taesung to show a single crack in his armor, had been watching. Inside the quiet safety of the penthouse, Nari was standing by the window, watching the city lights. She felt like a bird that had been caged so long it didn't know how to use its wings. The silk pajamas she wore felt like air, and for the first time in 15 years, her stomach was full. But a strange, prickling sensation crawled up her neck. It was the instinct of the street, the sixth sense that tells a ghost when a predator is near. She turned away from the glass just as the lights in the room flickered and died. Downstairs, in the high-tech security hub, Taesung's lead guard fell silently, a sedative dart protruding from his neck. The shadow enemy didn't move like thugs, they moved like ghosts. They knew that Taesung would burn the world for his sister, which meant she was no longer just a girl, she was the ultimate leverage. Taesung was in his study, looking at old family documents, when the silence of the penthouse changed. It became too heavy. He lunged for the door, his hand reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his desk, but a concussive blast rocked the hallway. Dust and plaster rained down as a group of masked men, moving with military precision, breached the perimeter. Nari. Taesung's voice was a roar of pure, primal terror. He moved through the dark hallway like a whirlwind of lethal intent, taking down the first two intruders with cold, calculated strikes. But as he reached the bedroom, he saw the balcony door shattered. A black van was already screeching away from the service entrance below. On the floor lay Nari's silver locket, the chain snapped, its metal cold against the carpet. A burner phone left on the nightstand vibrated. Taesung picked it up, his knuckles white, his breath coming in jagged, dangerous hitches. You found your heart, Taesung, a distorted voice hissed through the speaker. Now let's see how much you're willing to pay to keep it beating. The shadow enemy had made a fatal mistake. They thought they had found Taesung's weakness. They didn't realize that by taking Noir, they hadn't just found a flaw in the Mafia boss, they had unleashed a monster that no longer had anything left to lose. The search was over, but the massacre had just begun. The warehouse on the outskirts of the city smelled of damp concrete and old iron, but the air inside was about to ignite. When the heavy steel doors were torn from their hinges by the sheer force of a thermal charge, it wasn't just a rescue mission, it was the arrival of a hurricane. Yoon Taesung stepped through the smoke, his silhouette a dark, jagged omen against the moonlight. He didn't look like a man, he looked like the personification of a debt that was finally, violently, due. The Shadow Syndicate's men barely had time to raise their weapons before they were neutralized with the surgical, terrifying precision of Taesung's elite guard. In the center of the room, Noir was bound to a chair, a shadow of the girl she had been in the mud. But as she looked up and saw her brother carving a path through the darkness, something shifted in her eyes. The fear that had defined her existence for 15 years, the flickering, guttering candle of a victim, finally went out. In its place, a cold, steady fire began to burn. Taesung reached her in seconds, his knife severing her zip ties with a single, fluid motion. He checked her for injuries, his hands trembling with a frantic, silent desperation. "Noir," he choked out, "I'm here. I've got you." He expected her to collapse into him, to sob, to be the broken girl from the rain. But Noir stood up on her own power, her legs steady. She reached down and picked up the silver locket that had been discarded on the floor, its chain broken but its heart intact. She looked at the leader of the Shadow Syndicate, who was pinned to the ground by Taesung's men, his face bloody and defiant. "He said I was your weakness," Noir said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, resonant bell that cut through the silence of the warehouse. She walked toward the fallen man, her stride possessing a natural, inherited grace that mirrored Taesung's own. "He said I was the bait." She looked at her brother, and for a moment, the two of them were perfect reflections, the king and his long-lost queen. "He was wrong, brother," she said, her eyes locking onto the enemy with a chilling, royal calm. "I am not your weakness. I am your legacy." In that moment, Noir Salmon ceased to be a ghost of the streets. She was no longer the girl who was kicked out of shelters or mocked by students. She was the sister of the dragon, a princess of the underworld who had survived the worst the world could throw at her and emerged with a heart of tempered steel. As Taesung draped his heavy coat over her shoulders, he didn't see a victim anymore. He saw the only person in the world capable of standing by his side. Together, they walked out of the wreckage and into the dawn, two stars that had finally found their way back to the same sky, ready to rule the city that had once tried to drown them.